I was 8 years old when I learned something no child should ever have to learn. You can live in the same house as your family, eat at the same table, sleep under the same roof, and still be completely invisible. For years, everyone believed my parents were wonderful people. The kind neighbors admired. The kind teachers praised. The kind relatives defended. But one day, inside a courtroom packed with strangers, a judge looked directly at my parents and said something that changed everything. 3 words. 3 words that exposed a secret my family had spent years hiding. And when those words were spoken, my parents stopped smiling. Because for the first time in my life, the truth finally had witnesses. My name is Lily, and if you had met my family back then, you would have thought we were normal. A nice house, a safe neighborhood, 2 successful parents, 1 older brother everyone loved, and me, the quiet little girl standing just outside every family photo. This isn't a story about bruises. It isn't a story about violence. It's about something many people never notice. The kind of neglect that leaves no marks. The kind that teaches a child they don't matter. And the shocking reason a courtroom eventually became the place where my entire family fell apart. But before we get there, you need to understand how it started. Because the truth began long before the judge ever entered that courtroom. The child nobody saw. I don't remember my first birthday. Most people don't. But I remember my 8th. Because it was the day I finally realized something was very wrong. My parents never forgot my brother's birthday. Ever. When Ethan turned 10, they rented a bounce house. When he turned 11, they invited his entire baseball team. When he turned 12, they surprised him with tickets to a professional game. Every birthday was a celebration. Every birthday was a memory. Every birthday mattered. Mine usually felt like an afterthought. First, I didn't notice. Kids don't automatically compare everything. They assume their family is normal. Whatever happens inside their home becomes their definition of reality. So when my birthdays passed with a grocery store cake and a rushed happy birthday, I figured that's how birthdays worked. Until I started seeing how differently Ethan was treated. The difference wasn't subtle. It was everywhere. At dinner. At school events. At holidays. At family gatherings. If Ethan got an A, everyone celebrated. If I got an A, nobody mentioned it. If Ethan lost a game, my parents comforted him. If I got hurt, I was told to stop being dramatic. One incident still sticks with me. I was 7. My school hosted an art contest. I spent weeks working on a painting. Every afternoon after school, I'd sit at the kitchen table adding details. Tiny flowers. Clouds. A little red barn. I worked harder on that painting than anything I'd ever done. When the winners were announced, I came in first place. First place. I remember running home carrying the ribbon. I couldn't stop smiling. I burst through the front door. Mom, look. She glanced up from her phone. What is it? I won. Won what? The art contest. Oh, that was it. Oh, no hug. No excitement. No questions. No celebration. Just, oh. A few minutes later, Ethan walked into the kitchen. He had scored a single goal during soccer practice. My parents spent 20 minutes talking about it. I stood there holding my ribbon. Nobody even asked to see the painting. That night I cried in my room. Not because of the contest. Because for the first time I wondered whether something was wrong with me. Children don't naturally assume their parents are failing. They assume they're the problem. That's what makes neglect so dangerous. You don't think, my parents aren't paying attention. You think, maybe I'm not worth paying attention to. And once that idea takes root, it grows. Fast. By age 8, I had become an expert at disappearing. I stopped asking for help. Stopped sharing accomplishments. Stopped expecting anyone to care. Because disappointment hurts. But eventually, you discover something worse than disappointment. Hope. Hope is dangerous when nobody plans to meet it. So I stopped hoping. At least I tried to. Then my 8th birthday arrived. And everything changed. My birthday fell on a Thursday that year. I woke up excited. Despite everything, I still believed maybe this year would be different. Kids are resilient that way. They keep believing. Even when reality keeps proving them wrong. I got dressed. Went downstairs. Nobody said anything. Not my mom. Not my dad. Not Ethan. The entire morning passed. Nothing. At school, my teacher announced my birthday. The class sang. Friends gave me cards. For a few hours I felt special. Seen. Important. Like I mattered. Then I came home. The front door opened. Silence. No decorations. No balloons. No cake. Nothing. I walked into the kitchen. My mom was making dinner. I waited. Surely she'd remember. 5 minutes passed. 10. 20. Then finally I whispered, "Mom." "What? Do you know what day it is?" She frowned. "Thursday." My stomach dropped. "It's my birthday." Her eyes widened. "Oh, that word again." "Oh." She looked genuinely surprised. Like she'd forgotten. Because she had. Completely. She called my dad. He'd forgotten too. That night they ordered a pizza. Not because they wanted to celebrate. Because they felt guilty. Even at 8 years old. I knew the difference. And that realization hurt more than forgetting itself. Because for the first time, I understood I wasn't being overlooked accidentally. I was being overlooked consistently. There's a difference. One is a mistake. The other is a pattern. And patterns tell stories. The story mine told was heartbreaking. I simply wasn't important. Or at least that's what I believed. But there was one person who noticed. One person who quietly watched everything. One person who would later become the reason the truth finally surfaced. At the time I had no idea. All I knew was that someone had started paying attention. And my parents had no idea what was coming. Because the smallest witness often sees the biggest secrets. And ours was already collecting evidence. Even though nobody realized it yet. 1 month later, something happened that should have been impossible. A school assignment. A simple piece of paper. And one question that would eventually trigger the chain reaction leading to court. The assignment looked harmless. But looking back, that worksheet changed my life. Because it forced me to answer a question I'd spent years avoiding. A question most children answer without thinking. A question that revealed far more than anyone expected. And when my teacher read my answer, she immediately knew something wasn't right. What I wrote shocked her. What happened next shocked everyone else, including my parents. But before we get to that, you need to see exactly what I wrote. Because those few sentences became the first crack in the perfect image my family had built. And once that crack appeared, it never closed again. The following Monday started like every other Monday. The school hallways smelled like floor cleaner. Kids dragged backpacks across the tiles. Teachers balanced coffee cups while trying to look more awake than they felt. Nothing about that morning seemed important. Nothing felt life-changing. But sometimes the moments that alter your entire future arrive disguised as ordinary days. And this was one of them. The assignment came during language arts. Mrs. Carter handed each student a worksheet. The title read, "The People Who Love Me." ****. Most kids immediately started writing. Parents, grandparents, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, family pets. The room filled with scratching pencils and casual conversations. Mrs. Carter smiled as she walked between desks. It was one of those feel-good activities teachers loved. Simple, positive, easy, except for one problem. I didn't know what to write. I stared at the paper. The blank lines seemed impossibly large. The instructions were simple. List the people who make you feel loved. Then explain why. That should have been easy. But for me it wasn't. Because I didn't know the answer. Not really. I looked around the classroom. Kids smiled while they wrote. One girl filled almost the entire page. Another drew hearts around her parents' names. A boy beside me wrote about how his father never missed a baseball game. I just sat there. Frozen. Mrs. Carter eventually noticed. She stopped beside my desk. "Lily, everything okay?" I nodded. "Just thinking." She smiled. "Take your time." Then she moved on. I wish she hadn't. Because if she'd stayed a few seconds longer, she would have seen the tears gathering in my eyes. Not dramatic tears. Not loud tears. The kind you try desperately to hide. The kind that come when you realize everyone around you has something you don't. I stared at the first line. Then I wrote a name. Not my mother. Not my father. Not my brother. I wrote Mrs. Jenkins. Mrs. Jenkins was my elderly next-door neighbor. She wasn't family. She wasn't related to me at all. But she remembered my birthday. She asked about school. She listened when I talked. Sometimes she'd wave me over while watering her flowers and ask how my day was. Simple things. Tiny things. Normal things. But when you're starving for attention, even crumbs feel like a feast. Under her name I wrote, asterisk, she always notices when I'm sad. Asterisk, then I added another. My teacher. Mrs. Carter. Asterisk, she asks if I'm okay. Asterisk, then our school librarian. Asterisk, she remembers what books I like. Asterisk, line after line filled with adults who weren't related to me. People who saw me. People who acknowledged my existence. People who paid attention. When I finished, something was missing. The names most children write first. Mom. Dad. Family. I stared at the page. Then wrote one final sentence at the bottom. A sentence that seemed completely normal to me. A sentence that shattered Mrs. Carter's heart. I wrote, asterisk, sometimes strangers care more about me than my family does. Asterisk, then I turned in the assignment. And forgot about it. At least for a few hours. Mrs. Carter didn't forget. Not even close. She read the papers after school. Most were exactly what she'd expected. Sweet stories. Happy memories. Typical childhood responses. Then she reached mine. At first she thought she'd mixed up the pages. Maybe another teacher's assignment had gotten into the pile. Maybe there was some mistake. Then she looked closer. My name sat neatly at the top. The page was definitely mine. And according to everything written there, an 8-year-old girl couldn't identify a single family member who made her feel loved. That terrified her. Not because of one worksheet. Because teachers learn to recognize patterns. And she had already noticed several. The forgotten birthday. The way nobody attended school events. The untouched permission slips. The emergency contacts that never answered. The parent-teacher conferences nobody showed up for. The nervous way I talked about home. Separately, those details could mean anything. Together, they painted a picture. And the picture wasn't good. The next day she called me to her classroom during lunch. I thought I was in trouble. My stomach twisted into knots as I walked inside. Mrs. Carter closed the door gently, then sat across from me. Her voice was calm, kind, careful. Lily, I wanted to ask about your assignment. I nodded. Okay. She slid the paper across the desk. You wrote that strangers care more about you than your family. I looked at the sentence, then shrugged. Sometimes. The concern on her face deepened. What made you write that? I honestly didn't understand the question, because to me it wasn't a shocking statement. It was obvious. The sky was blue. Grass was green. Strangers cared more about me. Those facts felt equally true. So I answered honestly. Because they do. Mrs. Carter remained quiet. Waiting. Encouraging. Listening. And for reasons I still don't completely understand, I kept talking. Maybe because someone finally asked. Maybe because I'd been carrying the weight alone too long. Maybe because children tell the truth when they think someone genuinely wants to hear it. Whatever the reason, everything started spilling out. The forgotten birthday. The missed events. The ignored achievements. The loneliness. The constant feeling that I existed somewhere on the edges of my own family. I didn't cry. I didn't dramatize. I simply described my life, which somehow made it worse. Because when neglect becomes normal, you describe painful things as if they're ordinary. And that's exactly what I did. Mrs. Carter listened. Every word. Every detail. Every heartbreaking example. By the end of the conversation, she looked shaken. I thought she was overreacting, because I still believed my life was normal. Different, but normal. I had no idea how abnormal it sounded to everyone else. That afternoon Mrs. Carter spoke with the school counselor. The counselor reviewed records, attendance, behavior reports, teacher notes, everything. And a pattern emerged immediately. Lily rarely caused problems. Lily rarely asked for help. Lily never talked about family. Lily seemed unusually independent for her age. To many people that sounds positive. But professionals know something important. Children aren't supposed to be completely independent. Especially not at 8. When a child learns too early that nobody is coming to help, They often stop asking. And that silence can hide enormous pain. The counselor decided to meet with me. Then another meeting followed. And another. Each conversation revealed more. Not abuse. Not violence. Something harder to identify. Emotional neglect. The kind people overlook because there aren't obvious injuries. The kind families explain away. The kind outsiders often miss. But once someone starts looking carefully, the evidence becomes impossible to ignore. And evidence was starting to pile up. Fast. Meanwhile, my parents remained completely unaware. Life continued as usual. Or at least it seemed to. Mom focused on Ethan. Dad focused on work. Ethan focused on himself. Nobody noticed the adults gathering information. Nobody noticed school staff documenting concerns. Nobody noticed questions being asked. But somebody else did. Mrs. Jenkins. The neighbor. The woman whose name appeared first on my worksheet. The woman who had quietly watched our family for years. She saw things others missed. And she'd been keeping her own observations. Not officially. Not intentionally. Just mentally. A collection of moments that never felt right. Mom forgetting me outside after school. Dad missing every performance. Holidays where Ethan received mountains of gifts while I opened almost nothing. Tiny incidents. Hundreds of them. Individually harmless. Collectively devastating. And soon someone would ask her what she'd seen. When that happened, the story she told would become impossible to ignore. 3 weeks later, a meeting was scheduled with my parents. School officials wanted answers. Clarification. Context. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe everything looked worse than it actually was. That happens sometimes. Good educators know that. So they approached carefully, professionally, respectfully. But the meeting didn't go the way anyone expected. Because instead of concern, my parents became defensive. Instead of listening, they became angry. Instead of asking how to help, they attacked the people asking questions. And that reaction raised even more alarms. The counselor later described it as the moment things shifted. The moment concern became investigation. Because people who make mistakes usually want to understand them. People hiding something often want conversations to end. Fast. And my parents desperately wanted the conversation to end. Unfortunately for them, it was just beginning. What nobody knew yet was that a far bigger secret sat beneath everything. A secret connected to my birth. A secret hidden for 8 years. A secret that explained why I was treated differently. Why I was ignored. Why I never truly belonged. The school didn't know. Mrs. Jenkins didn't know. I certainly didn't know. But someone did. My grandmother. And she had been carrying the truth alone for nearly a decade. Soon, guilt would push her to do something she'd never imagined. Something that would tear the family apart. Something that would eventually place all of us inside a courtroom. Because the truth wasn't simply that I was neglected. The truth was far more shocking. And when it finally surfaced, everything people thought they knew about our family would change forever. The first time I noticed my grandmother acting strangely was during Thanksgiving. At the time I thought she was just getting older. Adults always said that when grandparents forgot things. She's getting older. She's tired. She's having a moment. But looking back, I realized she wasn't forgetful. She was guilty. And guilt has a way of showing itself in unexpected places. That Thanksgiving started like every other holiday in our family. My mother rushed around the kitchen. My father watched football. Ethan sat in the living room acting like the entire day existed for his entertainment. Relatives arrived carrying food and stories. Everyone laughed. Everyone talked. Everyone pretended everything was perfect. Family photos were taken. The same way they always were. My mother stood beside Ethan. My father stood beside Ethan. Everyone somehow drifted toward Ethan. And me. I ended up at the edge. Again. Almost cropped out. Again. It sounds small. But after years of being treated like an extra in your own life, you start noticing these things. You notice every exclusion. Every forgotten invitation. Every missing seat. Every moment where people naturally gather together. Without you. While everyone smiled for pictures, my grandmother watched quietly. Her expression kept changing. Sadness. Regret. Worry. Then something unexpected happened. After dinner, she pulled me aside. Not dramatically, not secretly, just gently. "Lily, sweetheart, come help me in the kitchen." I followed her. We carried dishes together. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. Then she looked at me, really looked at me, like she was memorizing my face. "You know I love you, right?" The question surprised me. "Yes." Her eyes immediately filled with tears. Actual tears. I had never seen my grandmother cry before. Not once. She quickly turned away, pretending to focus on the dishes. But I saw it, and something about that moment stayed with me, because it felt like she wanted to say something else. Something important. Something she'd been holding inside for a very long time. But she didn't. Instead, she hugged me. Longer than usual. Tighter than usual. Then whispered, "I'm sorry." 3 words. That's all. I'm sorry. At 8 years old, I didn't understand. Sorry for what? Nothing had happened. At least nothing obvious. So I simply hugged her back. Then returned to the living room. But my grandmother stood in that kitchen long after I left, staring out the window, crying, and wondering how much longer she could stay silent. 4 years she had protected a secret she believed would preserve the family, a secret she convinced herself was necessary, a secret that slowly became impossible to live with, because every year she watched me grow older. Every year she watched me become more isolated. Every year she watched my parents treat me differently. And every year the guilt grew heavier, until eventually it became unbearable. The secret began 8 years earlier. Before I could walk. Before I could talk. Before I could even understand words. It started the day I was brought home from the hospital. A day my grandmother never forgot. Because she noticed something nobody else did. My mother didn't look happy. She looked disappointed. Not nervous. Not exhausted. Disappointed. At first my grandmother assumed it was postpartum stress. A difficult adjustment. New parents struggle sometimes. That happens. But weeks passed. Then months. And the disappointment never disappeared. Instead it deepened. My mother bonded instantly with Ethan. She celebrated every milestone. Every word. Every achievement. Every laugh. But with me, the connection seemed missing. Forced. Distant. Unnatural. My grandmother noticed. My father noticed too, though he rarely discussed it. Everyone noticed. Nobody confronted it. Because families often avoid uncomfortable truths, especially when those truths threaten the image they've built. So life continued, and the divide grew larger, year after year. One evening when I was still a toddler, my grandmother overheard an argument she was never supposed to hear. My parents thought they were alone. They weren't. Voices carried through the house. Words slipped beneath doors. And some words can never be unheard. According to my grandmother, my mother said something shocking. Something that explained everything. Something that haunted her for years. My mother reportedly shouted, "Every time I look at her, I remember." Remember what? At the time my grandmother didn't know. Neither did my father. The argument continued. More yelling. More accusations. More pain. Then a sentence emerged that changed everything. A sentence revealing the existence of a secret buried deep within the family. My grandmother froze. Because suddenly everything made sense. The distance. The resentment. The neglect. The favoritism. All of it. 4 years she wrestled with what she'd heard. Should she tell someone? Should she intervene? Should she expose the truth? Every option felt dangerous. Every choice carried consequences. So she did what many people do when faced with impossible situations. Nothing. And that decision became the biggest regret of her life. Meanwhile, life continued for me. School. Homework. Birthdays nobody remembered. Achievements nobody celebrated. The routine never changed. Except now adults outside the family had started paying attention. School counselors. Teachers. Administrators. Questions multiplied. Documentation grew. Meetings continued. And eventually the situation attracted attention from people beyond the school. People trained to investigate concerns involving children. When that happened, my grandmother became terrified. Because investigators ask questions. Questions lead to answers. Answers expose secrets. And she knew the secret couldn't survive scrutiny forever. Not anymore. The first official interview happened on a rainy Tuesday. I remember because school was canceled early due to weather. Most kids were excited. I wasn't. A woman I didn't recognize arrived that afternoon. She introduced herself politely, smiled gently, spoke softly. She asked simple questions. Questions that seemed harmless. Who helps you with homework? Who attends your school events? Who do you talk to when you're upset? What happens on your birthday? What happens when you accomplish something important? Again and again I answered honestly. Again and again the woman wrote notes. Lots of notes. At the time I thought she was just curious. Now I understand she was documenting evidence. Evidence that would eventually become impossible to dismiss. Because one story can be ignored. 20 stories become a pattern. 50 stories become proof. And my life contained hundreds. Over the following months, more people became involved. Neighbors, teachers, relatives, family friends. Most describe the same thing. Lily seems invisible. Lily gets overlooked. Lily appears isolated. Lily rarely receives the same attention as Ethan. Nobody could explain why. At least not publicly. Not yet. But suspicions were growing. And pressure was building. Then my grandmother made a decision. The decision. The one she'd feared for years. The one that would destroy relationships. The one that would expose everything. She requested a private meeting. Not with my parents. Not with relatives. With investigators. Alone. When she walked into that room, she carried nearly a decade of guilt. Nearly a decade of silence. Nearly a decade of secrets. And she was finally ready to talk. According to later testimony, she cried almost immediately. Not polite tears. Not emotional tears. The kind that come when someone has carried a burden far too long. She apologized repeatedly. Then began explaining everything she knew. The family history. The arguments. The favoritism. The comments she'd overheard. The moments she'd witnessed. Hour after hour she spoke. And investigators listened. Carefully. Because every detail pointed towards something much larger than ordinary neglect. Something hidden. Something intentional. Something that explained why one child was cherished while the other was treated like an obligation. Then my grandmother revealed the statement she'd heard years earlier. The sentence that had haunted her. The sentence my mother thought nobody else knew. The room reportedly went silent. Because suddenly the entire case took a different direction. The neglect wasn't random. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't simply bad parenting. It appeared connected to a secret from the past. A secret investigators now needed to uncover. And once they started digging, they found something nobody expected. Not even my grandmother. Because the truth was even bigger than she realized. Much bigger. The discovery would eventually lead lawyers to become involved. Then court filings. Then hearings. Then a courtroom. And at the center of everything sat one question. Who was Lily really? The answer would shock everyone. Including me. Because the family secret wasn't about money. It wasn't about inheritance. It wasn't about crime. It was about identity. And when the truth finally surfaced, my entire life suddenly made sense. The truth no one was ready for. The courtroom was colder than I expected. Not physically. Emotionally. The kind of cold that settles in your chest before anything even happens. I sat between a court-appointed advocate and a social worker. I didn't fully understand why I was there. Only that adults kept saying words like, investigation, welfare, documentation, review. My parents sat on the other side of the room. They looked exhausted. Not guilty yet. Not proven. Just tired of being questioned. And then the judge walked in. Everything stopped. Phones down. Whispers gone. Breathing quieter. The judge reviewed the files. Then spoke in a calm, steady voice. We are here to determine whether this child has been subjected to long-term emotional neglect, and whether there are underlying facts contributing to differential treatment in the household. That sentence didn't mean much to me at the time, but it meant everything to everyone else. Because this wasn't just about attention anymore. It was about truth. And truth was finally being forced into the light. The first witness was my teacher. Then the counselor. Then Mrs. Jenkins. Each one described the same pattern. A child overlooked. A child isolated. A child emotionally left behind. Then the prosecutor asked a simple question. Why do you think this happened? Silence. No one had a clean answer. Until my grandmother stood up. She looked older than I remembered. Smaller. Like she had been carrying something heavy for too long. Her hands trembled as she spoke. I didn't protect her when I should have. Her voice cracked. But I know why this happened. The courtroom shifted. Even the judge leaned forward slightly. Because this was the moment everything changed. My parents stiffened. They already knew what was coming. But they couldn't stop it anymore. My grandmother continued. When Lily was born, there was a mistake at the hospital. A pause. Or at least we thought there was. Confusion spread through the room. She wiped her eyes. The hospital records were unclear. There was another baby born the same night. For a long time, there was doubt about whether Lily was biologically my daughter's child. A murmur moved through the courtroom. I didn't understand fully, but I felt something shift. Something heavy. Something hidden. My grandmother's voice lowered. And my daughter, she believed Lily wasn't hers. That sentence landed like a stone. She believed it for years. My father stood up slightly. Mom, stop. But the judge raised a hand. Let her finish. So she did. That belief changed everything. She bonded with Ethan because she believed he was the only child who truly belonged to her. Lily became a reminder of something she thought wasn't hers. The room felt like it stopped breathing. But the truth, she whispered, was never confirmed properly. She turned toward the judge. I requested a DNA review last year. Gasps. Even I felt something twist inside my stomach. Her voice broke completely now. And it proved something none of us expected. She looked at me. Long pause. Lily is her biological daughter. Silence. Absolute silence. Even the air felt frozen. The hospital records were wrong. There was no switch. No mistake. She is her child. The judge immediately called for the document to be submitted. My mother's face changed. Not anger. Not defense. Something worse. Collapse. Because in that moment, the story she had believed for 8 years shattered. And so did the reason she had treated me differently. The prosecutor didn't waste time. So you're saying the neglect was based on a false assumption? My grandmother nodded through tears. Yes. My father's voice cracked. You never told us this was uncertain. I tried, she whispered. But your wife refused to take the test back then. She said she didn't need proof to know how she felt. My mother shook her head rapidly. That's not, I was overwhelmed. But her voice broke mid-sentence. Because everyone in the room understood what had happened. A belief. Never corrected. Never challenged. Allowed to grow for years. And a child suffered because of it. The judge finally spoke again. Neglect based on assumption does not excuse harm. Then he turned toward my parents. But it explains it. That distinction mattered. A lot. I remember looking at my mother. For the first time, she wasn't distant. She wasn't distracted. She was looking directly at me. Like she was seeing me properly for the first time in 8 years. Her lips trembled. I didn't know, she whispered. But I didn't respond. Not because I didn't believe her. But because part of me didn't know what that meant anymore. Was I unloved? Or was I unloved under a misunderstanding? And honestly, at 8 years old, that distinction felt too big for my heart to carry. The final decision wasn't simple. It never is in cases like this. The court determined. Asterisk, there was confirmed emotional neglect asterisk. It was not intentional abuse asterisk, but it was sustained and harmful asterisk, and it was caused by a false belief about identity. My parents were ordered into mandatory counseling. Family therapy was required. Supervised reunification sessions were set up. Not because everything was fine, but because the court believed it could be repaired. That surprised me most of all. Nobody was taken away. Nobody was labeled a villain. Instead, something more complicated was acknowledged. Sometimes damage comes from misunderstanding, silence, and assumptions that never get corrected. Before the hearing ended, my grandmother asked to speak one last time. The judge allowed it. She turned toward my parents. I carried this truth too long because I thought I was protecting this family. Her voice shook. But I was really protecting myself from guilt. She looked at me again. I'm sorry, Lily. For every moment I stayed silent. Then she sat down and cried quietly. #the final 30 seconds. That day didn't give me a perfect ending. It didn't erase what happened. It didn't magically fix my childhood. But it did something important. It gave me the truth. And sometimes the truth is the first step toward healing, even when it hurts. If there's one thing this story shows, it's this. Children don't need perfection. They need to be seen. They need to be heard. They need someone willing to question what doesn't feel right. If this story made you think differently about how easily someone can be overlooked, then don't scroll past it. Leave a comment. Share your thoughts. And if you want more real, emotional stories like this one, subscribe. Because some voices are quiet for too long, until someone finally decides to listen.